Hello everyone, this is Caillou, and today I'm going to be doing a retrospective on Ghariv, the Quaking City, and its impact on the Revolution format. So if you're not familiar with Revolution, and if you've somehow stumbled upon this video, Revolution is one of the largest custom card constructed formats. It's a rotating standardized format made up of 5 to 6 custom sets at a time, and it just had rotation a week ago. We got a Duel Severo, a French Revolution inspired set, which I'm going to be talking about later on this channel. But yeah, since we just had rotation, it's a great time to get into the format. The format's super open, and there's tons of new things that you can do. So if you're interested in playing the format in one of our running leagues or monthly GPs, or just checking out some of the cards in the format, there'll be links to the Discord and our Scryfall-like search engine manifesto in the description. Revolution aside, what is Ghariv the Quaking City? So Ghariv is a custom Magic set developed by Canterbury Egg, and it was one of the 6 inaugural sets that are present when Revolution was originally created. As a result, it's kind of like laid a lot of the groundwork for what decks and archetypes have been mainstays in the format, and it's provided a lot of the staple tools that exist. But despite all of that, that doesn't mean that Ghariv was sort of explored and then solved early on into the format. Like any custom card constructed format, sets in them tend to undergo a process of discovery throughout their lifespan in the format, and Ghariv is no exception. So, how this is going to be laid out is, I'm going to talk a little bit about the flavor behind Ghariv, because I think that's important to understand where some of its cards and mechanics are coming from, and then I'm going to go into a card-by-card review of some of the most important cards that have had an impact on Revolution. So, flavorfully, Ghariv the Quaking City follows the events of its predecessor, Ghariv the Sacred City, which first introduced us to Jorah, the High and Holy. He's the high priest of the very directly named God. He has his own holy book, he preaches the good word and gospel, and he founded the eponymous city of Ghariv as a safe haven from the growing darkness that comes from the outside world. Throughout the events of the original set, though, we find out that Jorah is actually not as nice as he would want to believe. He's actually playing both sides, and while he has drunk his own Kool-Aid and genuinely believes that he's speaking God's words, he's the fanaticism that he has means that he believes that whatever his end justifies the means. So part of his true magical power comes from good old-fashioned blood sacrifice, either of his own holy blood or of whichever his followers are fanatical enough to follow him straight into the abyss. So through this, he kills 2 birds with 1 stone. The creation of demons that comes from his blood sacrifice creates a credible threat that makes people flock to him, but it also gives him literally more magic power, so he has both social and magical influence. So at the end of the first set, he's sitting pretty. He is in control of all of Ghariv, and with Ghariv, essentially the whole of the plane. Ghariv the Quaking City, however, brings a new threat, the Eldrazi. Coming from a plane outside Ghariv, Jorah has finally found an enemy that he can't reason with, cajole, threaten, and they're far stronger than him. So Jorah created Ghariv and basically spent his whole life trying to prepare for the invasion of the Eldrazi, but as the war against him progresses, Jorah kind of realizes for the first time in his life he is losing. He is losing the war, he is losing the faith of his people, and he is losing faith in himself. So this is a pretty dire and grim set in that sense. This whole conflict is represented in the mechanics of the set, with there being a faction mechanic for the Eldrazi, a faction mechanic for Jorah's side of the war, and one shared mechanic representing sort of the inhuman metaphysical nature of the paragons of both sides of the war. So the first mechanic is Reverend. So Reverend is essentially a tribal batching mechanic, just putting together angels, clerics, and demons. This is the essentially faction mechanic for Jorah's side of the war. And unfortunately, despite its kind of cool nature, I think that despite how much ever you agree that it succeeded, the original Ghariv definitely tried to put some interesting spin on the angels and demons and clerics and sort of the idea of worshipping them and lumping them all together, I think, is sort of a continuation of that. However, in Constructed, it barely had any impact. People tried it as a glue for some white-black aggressive shells, but both the nature of the mechanic with demons and angels, they're already high cost, they're powerful on their own. The payoffs are fine to lackluster, and oftentimes it was just better to play decks that lacked synergy but were high in individual card strength, and that made it hard for Reverend to find any footing in the format. Next up is Propagate, which is the Eldrazi tribal mechanic. And this one also was sort of middling, but it still had some shining stars we're going to talk about later. But generally, Propagate functioned as sort of an interesting big mana Fabricate variant that had some interesting limited designs, but was mostly there for aggressive low curves in Constructed, and we'll see that later. I think the third mechanic is the most important of them all. It is Coalesce, and with it the Revelation type. This is a returning mechanic from Cyberchronometer's Rail War, and this is a doozy if you haven't heard of it before. But how it works is they are sorceries with the Coalesce ability. When you coalesce them, it's effectively a flashback, and then they resolve onto the battlefield as a creature. So if you catch Preach's Hallowed Gospel from your graveyard, you'd gain 4 life, and then you get a 4/4 flyer. Obviously, by virtue of these being 3-for-1s, they were immediately impactful and sort of warped the format around them. They were one of many factors that made grave management a hugely important factor early on in the format, and we're going to be talking about some of the specific cards that encouraged that, but they gave big mana strategies some really go-over-the-top tools against mid-range decks, and they made it so that decks that traditionally wouldn't have late-game power could sometimes leverage revelations that had front sides that they wanted into some late-game grind potential. Okay, and with that initial context delivered, I'm just going to start going through each of the cards from Ghariv. So, to start off, one of the early boogeymen of the format was Sultai Reanimator. It was an exercise in emergence. The pieces mostly came from other sets like Monsters of Chikyu, Svergard, and Kutalia. Ghariv still also had some parts to play in it. So we're going to talk about some of those cards now. The first of these is Arcane Strategist. So Arcane Strategist was one of the few ways that you could mill cards turn 1 along with the Kutalia Surveil lands, and was part of some of the fastest starts of the deck, because you would mill something turn 1, hopefully / usually a threat, try to aggressively scry into a reanimation spell, and then it could block off and ideally trade off with some of the really threatening opposing aggro creatures, particularly Veil Touch Soulbinder. Arcane Strategist was later moved out of the deck in favor of Eavesdrop and other similar cantrips, but its impact on how the deck curved out and functioned was felt throughout all iterations of the deck. Another important instant from Ghariv that helped make the deck what it is Let the Truth In. So this is sort of an innocuous Thrill of Possibility variant at first blush, but it becomes a lot better when you realize it was the Reanimator deck's only way of dumping targets that ended up in hand into grave. It did so at instant speed, so you could really punish shields down moment from opponents. And even when you didn't have a reanimation target in hand, you could cash it in for extra cards by sacrificing your turn 1 Arcane Strategist because of the alternate cost there. Overall, Let the Truth In was a flexible, and I think one of the strongest pieces of the deck in terms of, if this piece didn't exist, the play patterns of it would look significantly more clumsy and worse as a result. Okay, now let's get into some of the reanimation targets and spells. While most of the reanimation targets came from Monsters of Chikyu, Ghariv did have one of the backup reanimation targets, which is Ashen Progenitor. It didn't do the whole board in a box thing as well as Chikyu Champion, but it was a respectable backup, especially since on its own, putting 18 power on the board meant that if your opponent had taken even a little bit of damage to their life total from trying to fix their mana, you could threaten to just kill them in one swing. And the 3/2 Eldrazi creatures were also very good at trading off against opposing aggro creatures. So, meanwhile, for reanimation spells, Ghariv didn't really have anything notable, but when there were nerfs to some of the other reanimation spells, its reprint of Rise Again became a crucial backup piece for the deck. It wasn't anything fancy, but it's really what the deck needed. Just straight 5 mana, reanimate a thing, no questions asked. Some other versions of the deck used Into the Breach, but the most important card for Reanimator, and honestly for the landscape of the format as a whole, from Ghariv, was Grasp at Frail Dreams. So this is sort of the first Coalesce card we're going to talk about, and it is a doozy. Strategic Planning is honestly not a bad card on its own, and being able to get another copy on Flashback made this kind of insane for most decks. In Reanimator, you're dumping your threats into grave. In Control decks, you're dumping other Revelations in there. You get to dig for your reanimation spells, or in Control decks, you get to dig for interaction, wipes, or your win cons, depending on what you're looking for. And speaking of win cons, it itself is a win con. It gave decks like Reanimator unprecedented grind potential and the ability to come back from being interacted with in the early game. Meanwhile, for interactive decks, it meant that you always had to have some way of attacking the grave, because Grasp at Frail Dreams was always a factor in being able to pull you through out of the late game into more win cons and stabilizing you. So, I mean, Strategic Planning is nothing crazy, nothing fancy, but when you add Coalesce to it, it absolutely is, and Grasp at Frail Dreams was one of the cards on this list that I can confidently call a staple of the format. So, with all of the support, it may seem like, okay, did Reanimator not just run over the competition? And while it was very strong in one of the tier 1 decks in the format, arguably, there were another linear threat in the format that was sort of encroaching on its territory. White-red aggro was devastatingly fast, had some blitzy starts, some grind potential of its own, and it had one tool that stopped Reanimator dead in its tracks, and that was Cyberus Clan Arbiter. I think it is fair to call this the single most centralizing card of the first few months of Revolution. Being hand attacked on turn 2 on the play was backbreaking for both Control decks and Reanimator alike, because you could, for example, like the card we just talked about, you could name Grasp at Frail Dreams if that was their turn 2 play, and put them off their tempo so much. If you're versus a Control deck, you just name their wipe or their their removal, and then all of a sudden you have a lot of space to just get damage in on them, potentially get under them before they can do anything. This card also used to be a 2/3, and with the Vigilance, that made it a pain in the neck versus creature decks as well, which is why it was eventually nerfed to a 2/2. Despite that, this is still, during its time, the best hate bear in the format, and it's not hard to see why. It forced lots of combo and Control decks to ask the question when mulliganing, if I keep this hand, do I just lose to a turn 2 Arbiter? And I think that for that question's sake alone, it's in the running for the most impactful card to come out of this set. And I think, might as well, since we're talking about the most impactful cards to come from the set, let's talk about Merciless Shieldbreaker. Merciless Shieldbreaker is a lot to read at first, but once you do, it's pretty terrifyingly simple. It's a 4/4 for 4 beater that when it enters the battlefield or attacks, one of your opponent's permanents is put on a clock. And that clock also comes with a big baboom face damage. It really forced them to have fast answers in a way that other threats perhaps didn't. And if you were able to get it out with haste through cards like Sermon of the Way, Elemental Surprise, or Ragefield Razorback, getting 2 triggers in a turn suddenly meant that an opponent was facing down 8 damage 3 turns from now if they didn't have a proactive game plan of their own. Of course, it wasn't all upside. There were a lot of spare tokens like Glyphs and Clues that you could just sack away before they rusted away. If you're planning to chump block or trade with Shieldbreaker, you could put the rust counters on your creatures and then just have them die anyways. These factors weren't enough from stopping Shieldbreaker from being one of the strongest cards in the format for mid-range decks, in fact, it is one of the only two cards from Ghariv to have a champion promo, which is a special promo card given to cards that were integral to decks that won our monthly GP. Merciless Shieldbreaker was used by all who wander in Grand Prix Tartok in a green-red mid-range list that had 12 sources of turn 2 ramp to land a powerful 4-mana Haymaker like Merciless Shieldbreaker on turn 3 and then carry the game from there. The only other card from Ghariv to have a champion promo is Riva, Heiress of Pinions. And we'll get to why it has a champion promo in a little bit, but first let's talk about what this card did early on into the format. At the very start of the format, she functioned as a top end for a powerful white-red tokens aggro list that basically said, I'm going to curve out 1, 2, and then on 3 play Riva. If you let me untap and attack with her, I'm effectively going to win the game. Riva is a really strong source of reach, and with it and Dramatic End, she basically was in the running to just run opponents over before they could drop a wipe or any of the traditional answers to white-red aggro. However, it wasn't perfect. You really needed Riva, otherwise the deck was in shambles. If they just removed her, you had a bunch of dinky little 1/1s that they could answer at their leisure. And what was found out throughout the course of the first few months was that other white-red aggro decks and shells were simply better / more consistent than the tokens aggro shell. With the death of those decks, Riva fell out of favor, and she was gone for almost a year. Until one day, a year later, the tournament organizers for Revolution decided to host a slightly different event for the monthly GP. To blow out some steam towards the end of rotation, they decided to have a brawl tourney. And obviously, when you think Commander, you think big value, big ramp, go big or go home. So people were looking for the best things to do. People are excited to play Planeswalkers as their commander because that's splashy. However, Dr. Chillbrain had a different idea. What if I just curved out into a guaranteed Riva? And the answer was, you just win the game before most decks finish spinning their wheels. Riva ran down, or should I say flew over, the competition, creating early pressure that forced responsiveness from proactive decks, forced responsiveness rather than the proactive gameplay from opposing decks. And then, because it had a win board stalls button in the command zone, it was able to still have some impact if the games went late as well. Okay, and while we're on the topic of Angels, and talking about GP winners, Reanimator was a super dominant deck in the early days of the meta, but it actually wasn't the combo deck that saw the most competitive success. That honor went to Shoot the Moon, of which Angel of Remembrance is one of the 2 major pieces. So it's hard to explain the combo that this is a part of, but the first thing to know is this used to say you would return a target permanent card with mana value 3 or less, rather than a creature card. That allowed it to return Lunar Vigil, and then Lunar Vigil's ETB would scry, and if you had and you could essentially, by sacking Lunar Vigil to its own ability and then looping it, you could draw a bunch of cards and get another Lunar Vigil into your graveyard, set up a trigger in your end step, loop 2 Lunar Vigils, and past a certain point, just force your opponent to deck out. So pretty complicated, but the specifics don't really matter. The point is, at the start of the format, people thought it was a 3-card combo with 2 Vigils and a single Angel of Remembrance. But as people brewed and tested new versions of the deck, they found that if you create a trigger during your end step, you only needed 1 copy of each, turning into a potent twin-esque combo. This meant that you no longer had to devote slots to being as all-in, and the deck started playing a bunch of hate bears like the aforementioned Cyber's Clan Arbiter, and then had a powerful aggressive game plan that made it so that you couldn't just rely on holding up interaction for the combo to win versus the deck. It put pressure on you from multiple axes. This actually ended up being the winner of our first ever GP. And while it doesn't have a champion promo, I think it still deserves to be remembered for that. After the tournament, the A+B nature of the combo and lack of clean interaction points led to Angel of Remembrance being nerfed to this current version, but it's still pretty iconic for the role it played early on in the format. Another strong deck early on to the format, though not GP winning, was Mono Blue Tempo. And lots of the pieces for this deck came from Ghariv, despite its all-star card Tidepool Turtle being from Monsters of Chikyu. So Ghariv provided two of its powerful counter magic suite. Cursory Glance answered most cheap cards, which at the time, there was a decent number of decks that were trying to play fast, aggressive, and just cheap cards as by their very nature to have things to do early on in the game. But Cursory Glance, unlike the taxing counter magic that's usually good in early turns, still had utility versus these cards later in the game. Siphon Memory was one of those taxing counterspells, but due to its remand mode, it really helped with the I just need one more turn to kill you sort of philosophy of tempo. And the card advantage meant that you didn't mind using it aggressively early on. Meanwhile, in terms of answering creatures and resolved threats, Ghariv provided another Coalesce card, Embrace Unending Frost. Usually tappers are not great and constructed, but Embrace Unending Frost being able to do it mana efficiently twice and put a body on the board meant that, again, it really added to that, okay, I just need enough card advantage, enough turns of you not getting to do anything, that I just end up winning, and Embrace Unending Frost was a big part of that. Much more important than Embrace Unending Frost, though, was Persuasive Orator. This was a godsend versus aggressive decks, where if they flipped one of their experienced creatures, you could the mana value would stay the same, so you could get a huge beater on your side. The tokens that were created by one of the reanimation targets, Chikyu Champion, you could grab those for just 2 mana. Overall, Persuasive Orator was really strong for providing a niche that blue usually doesn't get. It usually doesn't get cheap ways to interact with the board, and Persuasive Orator effectively being a Fiend Hunter style effect, except stronger in some cases, was really a big part of Mono Blue Tempo's success. And speaking of monocolored decks, Mono Blue Tempo eventually fell out of favor and instead turned into Blue White Tempo, which ended up winning a GP. But a monocolored deck that is sort of rainbowed over the format, despite its monocolor nature, is Mono Black Midrange. So it's almost been the You Must Be This Tall deck for most of the format's life. And this is due to a confluence of factors and cards from various sets, but Ghariv provided some of the strong tools that underpinned it, and one of those was Suffer Vile Retribution. So the other Coalesce cards we've seen have good initial effects, but you're mostly playing them because you're getting card advantage. Here, Diabolic Edict is honestly a fine card on its own, and getting another cast of it along with a 5/5 is just backbreaking. This was, I think, probably the most hyped revelation from the set. And while it was quite strong in Mono Black Midrange, an interesting thing is that it eventually stopped seeing play in Mono Black Midrange and started seeing play in control decks and big mana ramp decks or big mana control decks. And the reason for this is that Mono Black Midrange had, while it wasn't purely aggressive, as per its name, it definitely was trying to win the game at a reasonable pace / play the beatdown sometimes, and Suffer Vile Retribution didn't really work out in those game states. It was also the case that by the nature of aggro decks, if they curved out, Suffer Vile Retribution was sometimes worse than just a straight removal spell, because being able to target and point and shoot kill some of the scaling threats in opposing matchups was huge. So you really needed targeted removal, and Suffer Vile Retribution, if you couldn't guarantee that you're going to be able to coalesce it every game that you played it, it wasn't as good as some of the targeted options for Mono Black Midrange. But again, found a home in control decks and ramp shells. One of those pieces of targeted removal was Crucify. Crucify is essentially an attempt at a fixed dismember. You're always going to have to pay black mana to it. You don't get to half-ass how much life you pay. None of these things change the fact that it is still an incredibly impressively powerful card. Being instant speed and being able to be played on turn one was huge for curves, especially if you're on the play. Um, and the 4 life that it costs to do so usually was worth it because you would lose more life from letting them keep whatever threat they had around, anyways. This killed most things in the format and was, I think, the one of the, if not the premier removal spell in the format during its time there. That's not to say that the life cost was negligible by any means, but just that it didn't make this card so much worse that it wasn't one of the best removal spells in the format. Of course, mid-range decks can't just sustain themselves off of interaction, unlike control decks. They need win cons as well, and the best one of these was none other than Trezak the Heinous. I talked a little bit before about some of the most impactful cards / powerful cards from this set, and while there are a lot of good racehorses there, I would put my money on Trezak. This card is just so backbreaking. For 4 mana, you get a 5/5 flyer that kills a creature and draws you 3 cards. Now, of course, you have to put life into him, but lots of times just being a 5/5 body and killing something your opponent was doing, plus drawing into other cards that could stabilize you in other ways, made it so that Trezak, unless your opponent had face burn, was enough stabilization that you didn't really care about losing 9 life. And it was frankly obscene how often you'd see people put 9 life into him. But of course there's modality. Sometimes you don't need him as anything more than a 2/2, and you just want to stabilize, kill a thing, draw a bunch of cards, put yourself into a better game state than your opponent. And sometimes you just want to make him a 5/5. Sometimes you just want to draw 3 cards. Few and far between, I will say. Usually you're putting 6+ life into him. But the modality is a huge part of what makes Trezak powerful. And he just comes down on curve as this overstated, incredibly impactful guy. I don't know that there's much more to say. It's hard to overstate how powerful Trezak is. And he's my choice for the most powerful card to come out of this set, and a big reason for why mono black midrange had such a good matchup against opposing midrange decks. Next up, we've been talking a lot about sort of obviously powerful cards. The next one is one whose constructed impact may surprise people. It's Transcendent Effigy. When you first look at it, it looks like draft chaff. It's like one mana creatures tend to be not good in limited unless they're like hyper aggressive, and this is sort of, it's a 1/3 defender, sure, but like it's sort of pitiful. It's just curve filler. Where this really shined was in Esper Control, and the reason for that is a little card called Tindavale from Kutalia. All of a sudden, Transcendent Effigy being an artifact creature mattered a ton. You were totally fine with, if you had it in your opening hand, playing it early, having it just block some early aggro creatures, maybe even killing one of them, gaining some life on turns where your opponents don't force you to use mana, and then if it dies to a scaling aggro threat, it's in your graveyard for Tindavale. If you hit it off Grasp at Frail Dreams and don't draw it in your opener, cool, suddenly you have 2 types in your graveyard for Tindavale. It was a niche, but reasonably cool tech option for the deck. And I think that the fact that a card that would initially seem to be unplayable came about as having a cool constructed niche is part of the emergence that I love from custom formats. And speaking of that threshold, being 2 types and letting you potentially go up to 6 types in graveyard is huge for Esper Control because it lets you grab the big boy himself, His Holiness Jorah. Jorah is, I think, the classic control win con. He generates card advantage. He helps you stabilize by gaining you life. He kills anything, and notably for slow decks in this format, he excels graveyards, which means your opponent doesn't get any more recursive value. And he has a really mean ult. It's really rare that the game goes to the point where he can actually ult, but the few times I've seen Jorah ult, it has been hilarious. The opponent either instantly scoops, less funny, or they play it out and sometimes you can win. It turns out that some decks, their game plan doesn't care about you having the ability to make a 3/3 Angel starting turn 2 if they have some sort of like linear game plan that stymies that. Regardless, Jorah, I think, is the archetypal control finisher, and while he wasn't the only control top end that was played in the format, I think he was sort of an iconic one for the sort of flexible nature that he provided. Okay, we've talked about a bunch of different archetypes. The next few cards are all going to be about the ramp applications of Ghariv. And honestly, I think it's you have a big Eldrazi set, it's hard not to have a bunch of ramp cards. So, let's get into it. The first one we're going to touch on is Cobalt Basin. This innocuous critter, like its cannon counterpart in Dryad Arbor, was only really relevant in the meta when we had a Green Sun Zenith, in this case, Search the Unknown. There, it made Search the Unknown into a 2-mana ramp spell, while also making it into, while also letting it still be a toolbox piece. Once Search the Unknown rotated out, Cobalt Basin fell off the face of the earth, which is unfortunate because, again, land creatures add a little bit of an emergent factor to a lot of cards that otherwise might be innocuous, but no effects like Search the Unknown or things that could make Cobalt Basin relevant came up throughout the format's lifespan. Now, okay, if I know we're talking about Revolution here, but if I know there's a lot of overlap between custom formats, so if any of y'all have ever played MSCM and have played with Recall Forgotten Aeons, you know that one of the best feelings in Magic is playing a Coalesce card that it itself ramps you towards its own Coalesce cost, and that's why I think that this little guy here, Recall Forgotten Aeon's little cousin, oops, doop, doop, doop. There we go. Flourish and Calamity. Ignore all of that. The Recall Forgotten Aeon's little brother, Flourish and Calamity, was so strong. We had an Explore reprint from Sverigard, and so together they made an 8 Explore shell that honestly was really underexplored early on in the format. While we had a lot of good ramp tools, I think people were sort of intimidated by the linear options we had in the format and didn't want to try straight ramp shells and wanted to try something a bit more interactive. But as the format went on, these decks bloomed. So yeah, Flourish and Calamity, the 8 Explore shell only got its chance to shine when we got copies 9 through 12 with Scout Ahead from Karslav, which formed a really powerful shell that could, again, ramp out like disgustingly fast, but also had the ability to maintain card parity through these Explores. There's also its little brother, Thrive in Exotic Chaos, which was fine and was played in some ramp shells as copies 5 and 6 of Flourish, but overall Thrive in Exotic Chaos did not have the same impact. Now, speaking of win cons attached to ramp, Jade Champion was, I think, a ramp card that was played in a few shells and was really fun in those. Its main niche is that it could get you really powerful utility lands like Ascendant Peak, and then pay for their own costs through its combat damage trigger. And so you would usually play this in sort of decks that are in between mid-range and ramp, which again, Coalesce cards really let you straddle that line, and put a powerful threat onto the board while also giving you like late game insurance. Jade Champion I don't think was as played as some of the other ramp cards we're talking about here, but I think still deserves a shout out for the unique role it played in bridging the ramp and mid-range archetypes. So I mentioned earlier that the propagate mechanic was actually relevant in a single instance/deck, and that instance was the green-red propagate ramp deck. So it turns out that propagate actually has an interesting niche. When you are curving out with lots of propagate creatures, you have the opportunity to trade off versus aggressive decks slash gum up the board in a really annoying way. Um, and you'd still have your spawn creatures around. So either your opponent wouldn't interact with you in a meaningful way, and you just got to drop like an overwhelming grizzly on their heads and just kill them, or you would turn the spawns into more traditional ramp top end. The deck also had some really interesting tech options that let it be the beatdown in a way that other ramp decks really didn't have the opportunity to opt into. And one of these is Putrescent Carrier. So with Propagators, this reached its threshold of 8 like terrifyingly fast. Like turn 4 upkeep, this starts growing was pretty common. And while it might sound a little slow, um, hitting with a 4/4 trampler that grows into a 5/5 trampler, or sorry, that grows into a 9/9 trampler with really little to no other investment is pretty big. Note that the reason that it gets to start going on turn 4 is because colorless permanence counts your lands. So if you had a Putrescent Carrier and it came down even like late in the game, for 1 mana, all of a sudden you had a threat that your opponent couldn't ignore. The final piece and sort of the glue of the deck was Ophidian Invader. Had Propagate on its own, but it also had a repeatable mass pump. So it was sort of a mix of Permeating Maggot and Overwhelming Grizzly. It bridged the gap and allowed you to play a slower, rampier plan. Or if you really wanted to go ham, you could, and already had the mana, you could just pump it into Ophidian Invader and just kill your opponent dead. There was actually a really hilarious turn in the GP that this deck was played where the pilot of the deck activated Ophidian Invader's ability twice to kill with, I think, like 3 creatures on board. But yeah, I think all of these tools together came to create a deck that, while it might not have been tier 1, had a reasonable and unique niche and reason to be played in the format, and I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so another card that showed up in a bunch of ramp shells is a reprint of All Is Dust. So turns out when you can make your wipes one-sided, it really doesn't matter that they cost 2 to 3 mana more than your traditional wipes. And also, hey, it doesn't just hit creatures. So obviously, this saw play in the Propagate ramp shell we just talked about. Another deck that it saw play in was a Wildfire-esque deck with Destructive Force, where it was sided in against as additional rats versus aggressive decks. The last deck it was played in was actually the most interesting. So it was the final tournament of the first rotation of the format. At this time, Ghariv shared the format with Vostum, which was the first set to rotate out of the format, but one of the inaugural sets. It had a Vostum was unique because it was also a set focused around colorless and specifically had colorless slash C mana cards and a supporting mechanic for them called Wastes, where you could turn your lands into wastes, essentially make them only produce colorless as a cost to do something else. So those cards saw play in other shells, but really there wasn't much of an overlap between those cards and Ghariv's cards for a while, mainly because lots of Ghariv's stronger cards are these coalescers, which, despite having Devoid, did have colored costs in them. However, in this last tournament, someone finally tried to make the magic happen and brought the cards together, and with stuff like All Is Dust and some of the other color support from Ghariv, the deck really put on a good showing. But yeah, we were also talking about the Wildfire deck, and a card that was integral to that deck's success was the Chasmal Rift. Chasmal Rift was really notable as you can play a ramp spell on turn 3, usually one of your like scaling rocks. You play Chasmal Rift on 4. You can tutor up your Destructive Force. It cantrips each turn that you play a spell. It does like Immortal Sun style Jack of all trades, Master of none. But being able to tutor up your stabilization pieces in All Is Dust and Destructive Force, or into legitimate win cons, was a really potent factor of this. Because lots of times the issue is you put a bunch of ramp into your deck, and then your deck is super A plus B, and you never draw the B. Chasmal Rift prevents that from happening by being both in one. And of course, we've seen Coalesce cards that are both, but this does it on a different axis. So one of the best targets to grab with Chasmal Rift was Ghariv the Quaking City. not the entire set, the card. So, spoilers for the end of the story of this set, but Jorah eventually, in a moment of desperation, gets Ghariv, the whole city, to spark and planeswalks it away from the reach of the Eldrazi for now. Mechanically, Ghariv is, I think, appropriately a haymaker. It gets you card advantage, it gives you board advantage, it can kill anything, uh, asterisks obviously, but it kills anything unless your opponent wants to suddenly be left with no lands. And the ult is just game winning if you put like 2 cards into your sideboard. Um, so I think being at 6 was sort of the most awkward part for Ghariv. It was just at a point on the curve where mid-range decks couldn't usually justify it, and ramp decks could usually do better by going a little higher on the curve, but it still saw a lot of experimentation in play. And part of this was because it's an artifact, so you could do some neat things like tutoring it and ramping it out with cards like Experienced Armorsmith. So Ghariv just had like a lot of interesting deck slash niches it could fit into. Okay, and so we're talking about ramp, and this wouldn't be an Eldrazi set if it didn't have some sort of big, fuck off, oversized wriggle monster. And my favorite of those is Orvis the World Carver. So this was the top end of the aforementioned green colorless ramp deck, and essentially just said, when I resolve, you get to play the game less, and if you don't instantly kill me, I untap and win the game. You could form like the most common thing was just you pour mana into grabbing a Chikyu champion, Elemental of Surprise. You have a hasty board out of nowhere and you kill them. It also had some really interesting, more complicated piles to win the game if your opponent didn't let you win through combat damage. But overall, both Ghariv and Orvis, through interacting with outside of the game, really forced you to have like they made for some really interesting emergent gameplay through like the creation of weird little piles in the sideboard. And of course, both of them had steep costs associated with it, so it wasn't a companion situation. Unfortunately, even though Orvis saw play, the big meme daddy himself, Azumat, did not. But he's going to be forever remembered as the most expensive card in the format and for having his unique memeable 14 mana cost. So, the last big mana Eldrazi we're going to talk about is slightly different. It's Protoplasmera. So Protoplasmera saw a lot of success early on into the format in Red Green X midrange variants as like a flexible threat that could also be cashed in for removal or card advantage in a pinch. It sniped aggro dorks in the early game. It dominated late games with its command over combat and its greedy mana sinking, etc., etc. The issue it faced was really that it was just worse than anything else on curve, and that's obviously by intention, but decks were really trying to be proactive at the time, and like I mentioned earlier, lots of the true ramp threats weren't seen until later in the format. Protoplasmera did make a return in decks like the Destructive Force deck, where all of a sudden, when ramp is back on the menu and you're spending all of your first few turns just aggressively ramping and doing nothing else, Protoplasmera rewards you for that by being like, okay, you've done all of this, you're not dead, cool. You can cash me in for cards, you can cash me in to kill your opponent's entire board, you can cash me in for recurring value that your opponent has to interact with, otherwise they just outgrow everything they own, etc., etc. So I think Protoplasmera was cool in those decks, but in my opinion it was honestly underrated or overlooked in favor of Coalesce cards and other decks, because I think it's a hard card to quantify until you play with it, and then you realize, oh, it's expensive for sure, but there are a lot more windows to do the things it wants to do if you build your deck right than it might seem at first. Okay, and that's the ramp gauntlet right there. So we're gonna get back into talking about some of the haymakers from the set. But before that, I want to talk about some of the more low-key cards, sideboard pieces, reprints, etc., etc. We're going to start off with my good old buddy, Sanguine Proselyte. Oh, oops, no, where are you? There you are. Sanguine Proselyte. So, Sanguine Proselyte, along with Tartok Wanderer, formed a strong 8 copies of 1 mana creatures that died into other creatures. And this meant that Aristocrats' decks had a lot of consistency in terms of if they churned through their deck enough, you would have a lot of fuel. Um, and I think that it didn't do anything fancy, but just existing allowed the Aristocrats deck to be a thing, along with tools from other sets, obviously. Um, Sanguine Proselyte is also notable for having the dubious distinction of sharing card art with two other relevant cards from the set, which was really funny. Fortunately, only one of those Coke Soul is still in the format now, so now it's just something we look back on and laugh. Okay, now let's talk about some sideboard cards, and let's start off with the most impactful of those, in my opinion, Stroke of Nescience. So Stroke of Nescience is, I think, the strongest sideboard card to come out of this set, and if it wasn't for the need for Grave Hate from other sets, then I think it would be the strongest sideboard card in the format, period, for the time it was in. Hand Attack is generally good, and I think in standard formats, getting 1 mana Hand Attack is sort of a pipe dream. And Stroke of Nescience does two things that are really, really important. First of all, obviously, exiling the card is huge when there's so many cards that have value / recur themselves from the grave. The other thing is that looking at the top card of their library is a minor advantage at first until you realize that it really stops the issue that often occurs when you play Hand Attack, where it's like, cool, I'll just take this out. Oh, they top decked it, and I'm still screwed. Here you can see if they are going to draw that card again soon, and make an informed decision as to, okay, does it make sense to actually just grab the top card of their deck and then maybe just leave them mana screwed here, etc., etc. So, Stroke of Nescience, I think, because of those two additional points of power, is deceptively strong and had a big impact on how grindier matchups played out from the side as a result. Holton Clan Assailant is another strong sideboard piece. It was mostly played in Green X Stompy / mid-range decks, which didn't have, or just straight green because we had mono green Stompy at one point. They didn't have access to better removal or needed creatures as removal for some reason. It could kill aggro dorks, block aggro creatures, and do it all in a color that usually doesn't get cheap removal in this way. It was also relevant for a much funnier reason, but we'll get into that later. Next up, we have Chamber of Penance, which wasn't always a sideboard card, but I think in the role that it played in the format, effectively might as well have been. It's a catch-all removal spell that trades flexibility for being slow and intractable itself. It's a Banishing Light. It had some relevant in-format interactions. We talked about Experienced Armorsmith before, but for the most part, it was just sort of a staple effect that you want to see in the format that's slower but more reliable than other removal. It filled an important staple niche in its time, but eventually other Banishing Lights were printed, and it gracefully relinquished the stage to them. Okay, so Opt. We've all seen it. It is the definition of a cantrip. It's not that exciting. But if you remember way back when we were talking about Reanimator, there was another cheap 1-mana cantrip in the format with Eavesdrop. And both of those together meant that Spellslinger decks with another reprint, Sprite Dragon, suddenly became a lot more viable. As a result, I think Opt's absence is going to be felt a lot heavier than you would usually expect from a reprint of its caliber, and B, you would usually expect when there's a similar effect in the case of Eavesdrop still in the format. That lack of density for Spellslinger decks is really going to hurt. Another card that's going to hurt in a similar vein is Realize a Delicate Ideal. Realize a Delicate Ideal isn't just a Spellslinger card, though. It is amazing in lots of aggro decks and even slower decks as well. It falls in an interesting midpoint between aggressive and grindy. For aggressive decks, it gave them actual grind potential versus slower decks, helping them dig for burn or giving them a late game threat without having to compromise on their curve. In slower decks like Naya midrange, it was a great smoothing tool for early hands, allowing them to keep lowland openers that would otherwise be unconscionable. And it was kind of just a card that was never flashy, never exceptional, but it kind of didn't show up in as many lists as maybe it should have as like a consistency tool, but it was one of the foundational cards of several archetypes in the format, and we probably won't be getting a card as flexible as it for a while. Okay, so we've talked about Coalesce cards, Propagate cards, hey, even with this one, Devoid cards. And I mentioned earlier, no Reverend cards saw play. And the great tragic irony of GQC is that while it had an entire mechanic devoted to trying to make 3 different types of tribal easier to achieve and playable, none of those were its biggest tribal success. Rather, its biggest tribal success came from centaurs. And this was off the back of, we talked about Cyber's Clan Arbiter being a potent hate bear earlier, but it also just had a strong core shell. 2-drops like Cyber's Clan Squire and Greenglade Advocate just grew like terrifyingly quickly and could outsize other like aggro creatures at a reasonable pace, while also going toe-to-toe with other mid-range creatures later in the game. I think another big factor for the strength of the Centaurs deck was the presence of Hero of a Lost War. Being a 4/4 indestructible on attacks on its own was pretty not bad, but being able to grow smaller creatures and just keep its 3/3 body was also great. And I think the indestructible was really huge. Greenglade Advocate and Hero of Lost War both giving indestructible in different ways made it so that navigating combat was a goddamn nightmare for opposing decks. You really couldn't rely on just winning by playing defensively or being on the blocks versus the Centaurs deck. It also had good game versus slower decks, like we talked about Cyber's Clan Arbiter, but it had another hate bear in Mother of Hooves. Mother of Hooves static was really strong versus stuff like Reanimator, Coalesce, the Fossils from Mon, cards like Unite the Clans. And that's before we even get into the fact that she does have the Mother of Runes effect, which makes combat even more of a nightmare for your opponent, but also means that if she sticks around for more than a turn, control decks are going to be pulling their hair out. And speaking of making control decks pull their hair out, Unite the Clans is pretty great for that. Just being able to instant speed get a board in a box, and Centaurs have their own fun Unite the Clans in Sound the Blawhorn. So you could have decks like Centaur tribal decks with 8 copies of Coco. Sound the Blowhorn going up to 5 mana value versus Unite the Clans, which only goes up to 4, was also relevant not just because it let you grab Mother of Hooves or Hero of a Lost War with one of the potent 2-drops, but also because it let you just grab and Windmill Slam Mikal the Anointed. Mikal was one of the tools that let the Centaur deck have game versus other aggressive and like slower, like versus other aggressive decks, and also like against like mid-rangey decks. It's one of the 2 Baneslayer Angels in the from this set, and I mean, I don't think Baneslayers need to be explained why they're good. They stabilize. They're good on curve. They fly. They just make they're just overstated beefcakes, and honestly, sometimes that's all you need. But yeah, Centaurs were a tribal deck that found a legitimate niche in the format as a result, and with all of the pieces being just from GQC. So we talked about how Mikal was one of the Baneslayers. The other was Baptized in His Brilliance. And honestly, despite how sort of quote-unquote obviously powerful this card is as a Baneslayer plus or a Baneslayer can play from the grave, it actually didn't see play for a long time. People, again, wanted quote-unquote more reliable threats, and I think just sort of overlooked the card. I'm going to be honest. I think that lots of us just overlooked Baptized in His Brilliance. But being able to turn one of your early threats into, like, if you play off curve by 1 mana, turning into a flyer with first ring and lifelink, that's huge value for 1 mana, depending on the creature you're putting it on. And then in the late game, just getting a Baneslayer, well, again, that's lights out for most aggressively oriented decks. So I think that it's interesting that compared to actual factual Baneslayer Angel, lacking protection from demons and dragons is a relevant loss of tech / a nerf is pretty cool for the format's texture, especially because you get demons from this set, you get dragons from stuff like Sphere Guard. But yeah, overall, Baptized in His Brilliance was still just a pretty solid beat stick in its time. But yeah, speaking of cards from Ghariv that didn't see play until its lifespan in the format, and also had canon inspiration, let's talk about Oko, Trickster of the Trade. So, Canon Oko is one of the most single iconic Magic cards of all time, thanks to his impact on every competitive format he was legal in. But comparatively, Ghariv's Oko went underappreciated for a long time. And I think the reason for this is how unfavorably his basic abilities compare to Canon Okos. Um, if you try to elk something, the elk can immediately kill him on the backswing. His +1 is middling unless you already have board presence. And again, the 0, while it's reasonably good, but it requires you to have a permanent that's generating value on its own on your turn for you to like sort of pull ahead rather than just stay at parity. Um, and usually the amount of board like sort of like if you already have board presence that makes Oko relevant, the feeling was like it's sort of win more, or you have or you should play a creature that capitalizes on that board presence. Um, the overlooked factor, honestly, about Oko is his ult. His ult is terrifying. It wins the game on the spot. You can activate it 2 turns after he comes down if he isn't interacted with. And I think that lots of reason that it was overlooked is because every competitive Magic player has that point in their lifespan where they learn the lesson of don't evaluate walkers for their ults. It's nice that they exist, but in 90% of games you aren't going to get to them, and you should evaluate them based on their basic abilities. Where Oko is like, yeah, that's true, but my ult is also really, really achievable. So you have to factor that in. So, and people didn't realize that until he started seeing play in sort of like Sultai and Bant Super Friends shells. It was actually sort of a Super Friends shell with Essence Remade, which would try to pod walkers into Oko or Oko into Asahi the War Song, which is from Karslav and one of the strongest like single mid-range control finishers in the format. So it's sort of like, oh, okay, like I'm playing this deck because of Asahi. And then all of a sudden they notice like, oh, Oko, if you protect him, just wins the game on his own. So, and that sort of recontextualizes other abilities. If you had any existing board presence, you'd +1 for the hills and try to ult as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you use his 0 and -2 to be annoying and just keep him around until you can find an Essence Remade and then just use him as a resource to get into Asahi. And all of a sudden, the fact that if they are wasting removal on him or attacking him down, that bought you space to do other things. So while he thankfully was not as strong as his canon counterpart, Oko, Trickster of the Trade, was definitely stronger than people assumed at first blush, and had a cool niche in how he played out in the format. So I think that those are all the relevant cards from the set. I do want to give one honorable mention to a card that I think was on the cusp of doing some really cool things, but was sort of consistently overlooked. So this is just going to be my pet pick, and that's Play the Mortal Fool. This saw play in some shells, but it never really made it past like playtesting stages. I think that compared to other Coalesce cards, which were like cheap and riffing on like staples that decks like anyways wanted, Play the Mortal Fool, when its front face is 4 mana, it looks a little bit more unappealing. The terrifying part though is the fact that it curves pretty quickly into its backside, especially if you're ramping on 2 into like turn 3 Play the Mortal Fool, and then just hitting the Coalesce. You can do some really nasty stuff with this. And I think that it just has oodles of value with ETB creatures, and I think that obviously part of the issue is that you need board presence to really make this valuable, unlike other Coalesce creatures where they are the board presence. However, you can also copy your opponent's creatures, and I think that oftentimes you can just say, I'm doing you better than you, which is, I think, an overlooked factor of how the card plays. But yeah, I think the card could have seen success in shells that aim to put out recursive punching ETBs, like in Merciless Shieldbreaker shells, or with some of our other, like, Grey Merchant of Asphodel style effects. But even though it didn't, I think that it's always cool to look back on and think about, especially in custom formats where we never quite get to the point where formats are solved, what cards could have been. So, shoutouts to you, Play the Mortal Fool. I always believed in you, even if I didn't play you. Okay, and with that, that just about wraps up this retrospective. Obviously, these are not all of the cards that were ever played from the set. The set is deep, and like many brewers of custom card formats, Revolution players like to play just about anything and everything. However, I hope this was enough to give you a small taste of the format's history, an overview of this set's impact on the format and why I think it's cool and important, and I hope it motivates you to do one of two things. One, check out the set on Plane Sculptors. It's draftable there. Maybe draft it with your friends. And two, play more Revolution and see if you can find, like, dig through sets to find these sort of nuggets and find out the full potential that they're capable of. Because, again, no custom set in any custom format has ever truly been fully explored just by virtue of the player base size. So, do some exploration, do some digging. Instigator is linked right there in the description. And one last thing, thank you to Canterbury Egg for making the set. It's always cool. Again, this hobby would not exist without people willing to make and put out cool things. And formats would not exist without having sets like this to gush over. So I think that covers just about everything. So thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Caillou signing off.